pass the floor to my colleague Valerie Kwong to start the first part of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Ferdas. And thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to the speakers who will be sharing their insights later today to support the launch of this much anticipated report. Right now, I can't quite see the number of participants we have on the to all. So maybe to the next slide, please, to give some quick introduction to AIGCC. I have been with the company for over 3 years. I have to say this is one of the most exciting times because the report, as launched, it's going to send a very timely message supporting our work at Climate Action 100+, which is a corporate engagement initiative, which is also the initiative that brought me into AIGCC, focused specifically on corporate engagement. But to those who may potentially be less familiar with AIGCC, we are a pan-regional investor group on climate change, focused on supporting Asian investors' work in integrating climate into their portfolios. We are the founding networks rather, to numerous initiatives such as the Paris-aligned investment initiative, the investor agenda, as you see on the slide there. We have a milestone project, the investor climate action plans as well, which was recently launched, and Climate Action 100+, which is the initiative that I've just mentioned, focusing on corporate engagement. In terms of AIGCC's membership, we have grown significantly over the past few years, and the total assets of management from our membership collectively now accumulates up to $26 trillion. So perhaps just by way of going into more detail as to the focus of today, on the next slide, let's talk about carbon capture and storage. Now, there will, in the next few slides, be a couple of examples that I will be sharing with you, all about the CCS technologies and increasing reference by different companies to CCS as being, part of the solution to decarbonization. Just to, as your questions might come through as you listen to our webinar, please do pop them into the Q&A box, as Ferdas mentioned, and we'll try to get to those. As mentioned, we will be hearing, a lot about CCS in the next 2 hours. Just to define what that is a significantly expensive process that will require a significant amount of capital, most of which currently are coming from government funds. We'll see from the examples in a few moments. And I guess for today's perspective, it's for us to understand where we are currently in terms of our level of reliance to the technology, and at what scale are governments and companies putting CCS into as part of the solution to decarbonize. So here on the slide, we have China Shenhua. They, in their report, in their ESG report, mentions that they've launched the Jinjie Energy CCS project in 2019 with a capacity of 150,000 tons per year. CNOOC, they also launched the country's first offshore CCS project in South China Sea with over 1.46 million tons of capacity, the planned capacity for 300,000 tons per year going forward. And on the next slide, we'll see examples from Sinopec. Sinopec, it's already completed the construction of 2 sets of CCS devices, and it said that it can process up to 100,000 tons annually. It's also going to build the country's yet largest CCS facility of 10.68 million tons, noting that the purpose of it is to further boost crude oil production as well. Looking at another sector, for example, the cement sector, we have An Hoi Kong. They have also 50,000 tons per year that is already up and running. So on the next slide, let's look at other markets, what they're doing. Nippon Steel in Japan, we see that they have trademarked, for example, their energy saving carbon absorption process already commercialized. It is said that the sort of CO2 capture facilities will have a capacity ranging from 120 tons to 143 tons per day, depending on which facility we're looking at, the purposes of which is also for chemical feedstock, for CO2 removal, enhanced oil recovery, and CCS, meaning it will be stored underground. We have J-Power. They have also sort of announced that they have commercialized a plan for CO2-free hydrogen power generation combined with CCUS. So this is to be commercialized in 2026, and also another project that has already injected 300,000 tons over a 3+ year time frame. And finally, in Korea, in the next slide, please, we'll see that they have KEPCO have a utility developing a 10 megawatt class CO2 capture pilot plant. We can also see that CCS is one of the 4 main strategies to support the company's carbon neutrality goals. And the last example that I'm going to cite on is POSCO. They also have a process by which carbon will be separated from the byproduct gases in the operations. And the company says in their report that they will consider selling the captured carbon if they find a safe and sufficient storage infrastructure method to sort of run this process. So I've just very quickly run through all of these sort of taken everyone to a quick tour around Asian markets for you to see for yourself the CCS projects that are being planned for, some that are to be commercialized. There is a common theme amongst these projects, and that is that they're expecting that CCS will support the company's carbon neutrality goals for companies that have already set such ambitions. And other cases, we're seeing CCS being referenced as a technology utilized for other purposes as well. So in the next slide, we'll see sort of the theme for today. We're hoping to discuss, sort of have a discussion around what this decade, what we call this decisive decade for decarbonization looks like. And looking at the power and steel sector, I think will be helpful because these are the sectors that we're focusing on in the report that we are launching. And just to help us examine the overall role of CCS in the decarbonization pathway will be helpful. So in the power sector, we know that the role of electricity in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions is central to any plan to reach net zero. This is because it is the scope 2 emissions of practically all companies that need to purchase electricity to power their operations. And so from that perspective, it's relevant to all industries. It's the most direct way to cut emissions would be at source. And our understanding is that we can do so through using renewable energy and improving energy efficiency. Power is also well beyond sort of a commercial consideration. We understand the energy security aspects of it. So it's often the top of the agenda item for most national governments. So governments will be looking for stable and relatively low cost electricity, which will understandably be a national imperative. And according to the IEA Net Zero by 2050 report, and I think that's really important. So maybe also let's look at the steel sector. The steel sector, it functions similarly from a sense that it has an enabling role to determine the carbon emission levels of other end-use sectors. So in construction, for example, transportation and also industrial, these are sectors that will be significantly impacted by whether or not the steel industry is able to decarbonize. We understand that there are two main production methods for producing steel. One is through blast furnace and basic oxygen furnace processes. This production method is % of the total production methods for steel. But there is also another method called the electric arc furnace production method, whereby scrap steel, direct reduced iron, they will be used as the raw material. So overall, for the steel sector, it contributes to 8% of the final energy demand. So also a sizable source of carbon emissions. But unlike the power sector, it's a hard to abate sector, meaning we don't currently have a very clear or direct a solution to net zero transition. So the path for that is less straightforward. So maybe let's sort of look at the next slide. When we think about sort of talking about decarbonizing these two sectors, what exactly is the challenge ahead? And for the purposes of today's forum at China SIF, we thought that it would be helpful for us to look specifically from the lens of China. So a few statistics that people probably know, but perhaps helpful to reference on to set the scene, is that China is highly dependent on coal to generate electricity at the moment. 53% of its is coming sort of, it sort of contributes to 53% of the world's total coal-fired power. So clearly to reduce the country's reliance on coal is a tall task, but it's one that needs to be done. Having said that, we've seen sort of, we've known quite sort of recently that decarbonizing the entire sector is a really difficult task. From the steel perspective, we do see that China is, by clear means, that they are the world's largest steel producer. And from emissions perspective, from this sector, it contributes to 10 to 20% of the country's emissions. But having said that, we do note that for the steel sector specifically, there are plans for the country to peak emissions coming from the steel sector by 2025, and overall by 2030 for carbon emissions from the steel sector to decrease by 30%. So very ambitious goals there, and we can sort of anticipate that there's much that needs to be done. So what exactly does that what exactly does it need to take for governments and companies to meet these climate goals that they've pledged to become Paris aligned to? And whether or not CCS is the answer, it's something that's worth really looking into much more detail on. And so for that reason, on the next slide, we have sort of, our team has put our heads together. We note that CCS deployment is being implied significantly in many heavy emitting sectors. And we found it necessary for us to look into sort of the feasibility of this assumption that CCS is to be sort of relied upon. So with this report that we are launching here, we wanted to sort of triangulate and interpret the various reasons that are put out there, whereby the assumptions are for CCS to be deployed as a decarbonization strategy. We want to we do so by examining the cost competitiveness of CCS deployment. And we do want to get investors to ask of companies their approach on CCS, if that's being cited as the main decarbonization solution. But ultimately, this report, we do want to caution on the level of reliance on CCS in the current decarbonisation plans. So I'll leave a lot of the detail to the good hands of Wood Mackenzie, who is the consultants which we have commissioned to conduct the economics analysis to. But before we go into detail and before I pass on to them, just a few high-level things that I think we should keep an eye out for. In the next slide, please, Fergus. So key discussions in the report for the power sector, for example, whether or not there's a case for CCS and what the competing technologies are. We do know, for example, that renewable energy is the most direct way to decarbonize. However, we do acknowledge that they're intermittent by nature. Question is where the question is would be whether or not CCS retrofits for this remaining fossil fuel energy is viable. The competing factor, I think, is the cost competitiveness of renewable energy, and also very importantly, the battery storage costs, the development of long duration batteries, where that technology is up to by that time. So we'll hear more about that. For the steel sector, as mentioned, it's a hard to abate sector. We can't expect blast furnaces to be fully substituted by existing options overnight. Then we're seeing a very clear trend that hydrogen options are also emerging, and they will at some point commercialize. And so potentially CCS could play as an interim solution to decarbonization, the decarbonization pathway. So the competing factor would be of which the speed emerges as the zero carbon feedstock. It's significantly important because it implies that there are some fundamental changes to the overall steelmaking process. But ultimately, to truly decarbonize the process, we do need to see to the use of green hydrogen as well, meaning that hydrogen is being powered by renewable energy sources as well. So that's one big factor that's in the cards. Another competing factor would be the availability of scrap steel. However, we do know that steel is already the most recycled material in the world, so it's an ongoing process. Now, so other parts of the report, we do go into a few case studies and some detail into challenges that we see with the deployment of CCS. So just very quickly going through some of these would be the environmental risks. We talked about the potentials for leakage, whether it's abrupt or gradual. The leakage could potentially be of hazard to human health if it's released in high concentration, or if it gains access underground on terrestrial or marine ecosystems. There could also be relevant contamination or damages. The injection of large volumes of CO2, if not done in suitable locations, is said to have potentially could potentially have the result of inducing seismicity as well. Another issue not to overlook is the potential to water stress, because most of the CCS operations that we see is it uses the absorption technologies. So that means it will be a very water-intensive technology, as a water-intensive process as well. So potentially there could be high costs of ramifications, and these are things that we do need to keep in our line of sight. The technical, the technology perspective of it is also proven to be challenging. We have one case study in the report where we look in Chevron's LNG carbon capture project, initially the largest commercial CCS project, but it was delayed by 3 years and then cited challenges in meeting its designated capacity in capturing carbon. So that's also one thing, one case study to look into. In the next slide, we have the other three other challenges that we've outlined. For example, there are currently no examples of commercial banks financing CCS projects outside of the US. we do have the Petronova CCS project as the case study there. They've announced earlier in the year to shut indefinitely because of previous collapse in oil prices, which has then made the facility uneconomical at that point. The social perspective, we understand that the projects with CCS will likely be characterized as the not in my backyard facilities, because they will contain hazardous materials which needs to be carefully transported and stored. These again could potentially lead to social opposition. We also look at the competitive deployment of resources to support other emerging technologies as well, which will also need large capital will have large capital needs. And so all of that builds to the challenge of CCS deployment, as it will need to compete with other technologies. So I think I've gone on for quite a while. I'll pause there, noting that I've posed a few challenges, and as we're trying to grapple with the feasibility of using CCS as a solution to decarbonize, I think it's also important that we hear from the cost competitive perspective. And as promised, we'll hear from Wood Mackenzie to do that. So Ferdas, maybe I'll pass over to you for some basic introductions, and let's then go directly to Wood Mackenzie's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. So the next presentation will be about cost competitiveness of CCS deployment, which is an analysis that AIGCC assigned Wood Mackenzie, and now Wood Mackenzie will present them. Let me introduce the speakers. Joshua Ngu, the Vice President. He's based in Singapore and leads Wood Mackenzie Upstreams and Low Carbon Consulting in Asia Pacific. And also Alan Chan, the Principal Consultant, which is also based in Singapore and has extensive experience in the upstream gas and LNG sectors. So I'll pass on to Joshua and Alan for the next presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Firdaus. I hope everybody can hear me fine. All right, let's get straight. Thanks, Valerie. Let's get straight into it. So if we move on to the next slide, good afternoon, first of all, to all of you on this call today. I guess as shared by Valerie and Firdaus, Wood Mackenzie has been engaged by AIGCC to conduct a cost competitiveness analysis of CCS in the power and steel sector. But before we jump into the details and outcomes of our study, I thought it would be a kind of a nice opportunity for us to quickly introduce Wood Mackenzie. So Wood Mackenzie has been a leading company in providing market intelligence and analytics in the energy and mining sector. We've been around for more than 50 years and has more than 35 offices globally. So Wood Mackenzie has been the go-to company for majority of the players in the energy sector who are seeking advice on market information or just consultancy. And we pride ourselves in our integrated analysis. We do not necessarily only cover upstream or certain parts of the other energy sector. We do cover the entire energy sector, from oil, gas and LNG, power renewables, chemicals, metals and mining, and more importantly, low carbon technologies. And that's a key theme for us today. And so this is where we're coming from. And this is what Wood Mackenzie is all about. If we move on to the next slide. So our presentation today is really structured into 4 sections. I'll start off with a quick introduction of this study before I'll pass on to Alan, who will walk us through the key insights for CCS in the power generation sector. And then we will cover the steel sector. We will then conclude our presentation before opening up for Q&A. So here again, just a reminder for everyone, should you have any questions, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box, and we will pick it up towards the end of this presentation, and hopefully we will have time to cover all the questions. All right. Okay, moving on to the introduction. So, CCS is seen as a key solution for our world to achieve our climate change goals. Right? Many companies have mentioned that they will leverage CCS as a key technology for them to reduce their carbon emissions. And indeed, if you look at what's changed over the last year or so, the pipeline of CCS projects have increased from 100 million tons to 400 million tons. So that's an increase, a significant increase of 300 million tons over the course of a year. Now, the word of caution here is these are projects that have been announced, but not necessarily have been FID'd. And there are quite a few challenges with it. And to note, based on Wood Mackenzie's 2-degree scenario, we estimate that 4 gigatons of CCS capacity is required for us to achieve our 2-degree scenario. And this is Wood Mackenzie's 2-degree scenario. And if you think about where we are today versus where we need to get to, there is a significant gap that we would need to fill. And here, the question really comes back to, is it feasible? And is it plausible for governments and companies to rely on CCS to underpin decarbonization, their key decarbonization strategies? So there are many considerations when it comes to the development of CCS. And we recognize that cost competitiveness is a central consideration. And thus, we have worked with AIGCC to conduct an indicative analysis on CCS cost and kind of consider how they compare against other low carbon options. So our focus is on the key emitting sectors, steel and power, as mentioned by Valerie, in the major economies in Asia, Japan, Korea, India, and China, who are also major economies in the world. And the analysis comprises the comparison of levelized cost of each option on a greenfield basis at various snapshots in time, which is 2021, 2040, and 2040 as well. Okay, and what we are looking to do here is to understand the cost competitiveness under 2 scenarios. One is a base case scenario, or Wood Mackenzie's base case scenario, where we look at existing policies and look at the evolvement of prices and scenario to think about how a 2-degree scenario can be achieved. And so we work based on an outcome and think about how we can achieve this based on the different levers that can be applied to achieve the 2-degree scenario. What we plan to do, or what we intended to do, was to show you the cost competitiveness, but also some of the other commercial considerations that come along with the deployment of CCS. So over the next few slides, you would see a lot more of these considerations being mentioned and highlighted. And I'll now pass on to Alan to cover the details of the output. So Alan, I'll pass on to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Josh. First, if you can jump to the next slide. So good afternoon, everyone. So for the next 2 sections, both on the power industry and on the steel sector, what I'd like to do in each of the segments is to first go over some of the common trends and observations that we have made that are applicable to all 4 of the markets which we have analyzed. And from there, try to help highlight or illustrate to you a different perspective into how one should look at CCS. For the power sector, I think it would not come as a surprise to anybody that renewables is already highly competitive and will become the most competitive option on an LCOE, or levelized cost of energy basis, across all 4 markets in the near future. And that advantage will only widen in all markets. However, it's not just about cost, right? Cost is only one critical element, but not the only factor at play. Renewables, as Valerie mentioned previously, is intermittent. And as such, there is a need for a dependable source of power generation in order to provide electricity when the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing. And to that extent, in that regard, gas and coal will continue to fulfill that critical role going into the future. And by extension, that also applies to CCUS. So when you think about it, the role of CCUS is not really to compete directly with renewables, but rather to fulfill the role of providing dependable capacity. In that regard, if you think of it that way, what CCUS retrofits will compete against is not renewables, but rather the non-CCUS, the non-abated gas and coal-fired power generation in order to fulfill that niche. In that regard, policy support will then play a major role in dictating the competitiveness of CCS versus traditional unabated gas and coal. I also like to highlight, beyond just policy, there are a few other additional considerations with regards to the potential for CCS. And this includes the need for grid reliability, which will dictate the amount of dependable capacity that needs to be in place to provide a certain level of reliability. Overall system costs, meaning the cost of new infrastructure required to basically bring in power from distributed, from various renewable sources, bring them to market. And finally, the availability of long duration battery storage, which can eventually compete as an alternative to the CCUS equipped gas and coal power generation. Right. So let's look a bit deeper into the landscape for the power generation sector, and also understand what are some of the factors or some of the options which are at play. On the left-hand side, what we have included is a outlook based on our 2-degree scenario, showing the power generation output to 2050, specifically for the 4 markets, Japan, Korea, India, and China. So I'd just like to explain that this is merely a projection underneath a 2-degree pathway, rather than a forecast made by Wood Mackenzie. And in that regard, it is but one potential outcome out of many, many potential future possibilities. But what I would want to highlight here is really just the indicative trends of how we expect the sector to evolve in a 2-degree scenario. The number one is around the tremendous growth in electricity demand across the 4 markets. And this is primarily driven by the use of electricity to decarbonize other sectors, and in particular, use of in the mobility and transport sectors, such as electric vehicles and such. Second key takeaway here on the chart is that the future energy mix will not be completely dominated by one form of energy or another. It will require contributions from all forms of energy. Of course, renewables is expected to play a dominant role in this power mix. As you can see in the green and the gray, they will eventually comprise up to 60% of the output by 2050. Is a clear choice, being both low carbon, low cost, and scalable to deliver a lot of new capacity. However, the same problem remains. The grid reliability still remains a concern because of the intermittent nature of renewables. As such, the grid will need to rely on other forms of power generation, including from gas and coal, which in our projection here will take up about 1/5 of the power demand, even towards 2050. Now, one may ask, there are other forms of dependable capacity from other sources, such as nuclear and hydro. In our projections, even though nuclear will grow quite significantly towards 2050, it would not be at which it can fully substitute gas, and coal. And the same goes for other forms of generation, such as geothermal or even hydrogen-fired power plants. And therefore, what we see is that a continuing role for gas and coal, and in that regard, a continuing room or continuing space to deploy CCS. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, let's take a closer look at the results of our cost competitive analysis and what we can draw from there. What you see here is a comparison of the average levelized cost of energy on a greenfield basis for various forms of power generation, specifically for China. You'll see three graphs here. On the left-hand side, where we label as ETO 2021, that's basically the current view. In the middle chart, ETO 2040, that's basically Wood Mackenzie's base case based on the current trajectory, which is aligned with a 3-degree pathway. And on the right-hand side, we have a AET2 2040, which is Wood Mackenzie's 2-degree pathway scenario. So what are the key things that we see here? Well, if you look at the orange and the green, which represent renewables and renewables plus short duration storage, you can see a clear trend here that both renewables and renewables plus storage will be the most cost competitive, even in a base case scenario, but especially so in the 2-degree pathway. However, as I mentioned previously, cost is not everything. No. Fossil fuels and CCS would still need to fulfill a vital niche role in providing dependable capacity. And so, as I mentioned a few slides prior, what CCS needs to compete is not necessarily to be cheaper than renewables, but rather to be economic against typical non-abated gas and coal power plant. And so what you see in, for example, in the middle chart, around 20 case, where we look at the current trajectory of carbon prices, they're insufficient to spur the retrofit of gas and coal. And so in such a view, in such a world, unabated gas and coal will continue to could potentially then continue to be the option to provide dependable capacity. However, if we look at our AET2 scenario, where the policies and carbon prices are in place to encourage a retrofit of US to gas and coal, in this case, CCS retrofits become viable. And this picture is quite consistent across all 4 of the markets we looked at, India, Korea, Japan. In the Chinese context, well, what does this mean? Well, for sure, renewables are going to be the most competitive. We'll see the strongest growth moving forward. However, if you look at some other factors, such as the electricity demand growing so strongly over the next few decades, and also China's fleet of coal plants being so young. And finally, if you look at the working guidance that was issued by the government prior to COP26, where they say even in the 2060 point of where net zero is to be achieved, even they allow for 20% of fossil fuel, allow for 20% of energy consumption to be provided by fossil fuels, assuming that it is either captured or offset. So all these factors indicate that CCUS will continue to have a role to play in the power mix. Okay, next slide, please. So if you were to look at CCUS in the power sector, what are some of the factors that you would like to that you should look at? As mentioned, the viability of CCUS should rely on a great extent on policy support. And hence 4 of the factors that we highlighted in the green up above to help CCUS become more competitive relate to policy, whether this is in the form of higher carbon prices or in availability of subsidies, direct project subsidies to reduce the cost of projects. But beyond just pricing, carbon pricing and subsidy, there could be, beyond just the carrot, there can also be a stick, right? There can be government commitments to net zero, which can force companies to decarbonize. And finally, the higher requirement for dependable capacity, This, to a large extent, relies on the government's the level of reliability that governments would require for the electricity grid, and then that would dictate how much dependable capacity that needs to be fulfilled. The other factors include the greater cost improvement in CCUS, as we're seeing in recent months. There have been projects such as hub developments of CCUS, new technologies developed for CCUS. So as there becomes greater deployment of CCUS, we should you would expect the cost of CCUS to reduce and therefore make it more feasible for the deployment. And finally, last point in green is around renewables. With renewables, levelized cost is not everything. It also requires a number of external elements, such as land availability, deployment of infrastructure, licensing, and so forth. So you'll need a lot of other elements to be in place in order to meet the already very, very ambitious goals for the renewables deployment. On the flip side, what will be things that can have impact or make CCUS less likely or less competitive? Well, this will include the viability of other capacity, such as, for example, if increased deployment of nuclear, or even the quicker development of long duration storage or hydrogen-fired power. Finally, around the greater availability for renewables, this refers to greater efficiency, greater availability for renewables project, which can also decrease the demand for CCUS. Right, next slide, please. So moving on to the steel sector. Once again, I'd like to touch on some of the high-level trends and observations for the steel sector. The steel sector differs from the power sector in that it doesn't have a clear-cut option such as renewables and power. Really, you can consider there are three major pathways to make iron and steel. The majority of the current deployment and where the majority of emissions comes from the blast furnace process. There are other lower emissions processes, particularly DRI and scrap, as Valerie mentioned earlier. But the key point here we want to highlight, these are not fully substitutable with blast furnace. So while these lower emissions process will grow significantly on a global basis, blast furnaces will remain in use because there are certain applications where you cannot substitute them. And even to 2050, you would still need blast furnaces. And therefore, if you cannot substitute it as an application, then you would need it to decarbonize it. And that is where CCUS comes in. And it's very similarly to power. Once again, you will need policy support to spur those retrofits. A wild card that we like to highlight here is around the use of hydrogen-based feedstocks as a way to decarbonize blast furnace applications, and therefore supplanting the need for CCUS. However, unlike renewables, the technology is still nascent. It's either in a pilot stage or as a part of research projects. So therefore, it may potentially still be a ways off, both in terms of you need to set up the supply chain, and second, there are still technical challenges associated with the process that need to be addressed. Hence, it would be something that will only come forward in the long term. In 2-degree scenario, what we observe across all markets is that all the options still actually remain relatively competitive in cost. So therefore, there's no clear options such as with renewables. There's a lot of variability associated with the different feedstock costs that would dictate which option will win out. Right. So let's look at what are some of the options at play here. As mentioned, blast furnaces remain the dominant form of steel production at present, accounting for over 80% in the Japan, Korea, India, and China markets. Most of this would be deployed in China and India, whereas in Japan and Korea, they're mostly already using scrap. What can we observe here through our projection, again, in a 2-degree pathway? First is that the blast furnace application will decrease in terms of market share quite significantly down to around 25% in 2050. This is due to a lot of this is driven by preference for lower emitting options such as scrap, taking more market share. But ultimately, even in 2050, blast furnaces remain relevant because they are pretty much the only scalable option for you to convert low-grade iron ore into steel, and also for in places where there's limited feedstock options. The second point I want to highlight here is around scrap, where you see in the gray, it grows from a proportion of around 15% to almost tripling to over half the capacity by 2050. It is certainly a low carbon option, but there's a fundamental characteristic here in that it relies on the recycling of scrap, and to extent the availability and the quality of scrap then dictates how much scrap furnaces can be, scrap EAF applications can be deployed. The third main point here is around hydrogen. As mentioned, hydrogen is a big wild card here. In our 2-degree pathway, we see it only becoming commercial sometime in the mid to late 2030s, and therefore the deployments of hydrogen-based feedstock will then only come into play in 2040 and 2050, but growing quite quickly, and substituting a lot of the conventional blast furnace options. Next slide, please. So if we look at once again at the cost competitiveness perspective for China across the 3 different cases, what does it show us? Well, in the case for China and also for India, what we see is that scrap will become the most cost competitive to 2040, both in our base case and in our 2-degree scenario. But once again, cost isn't everything. Scrap will still be limited by the availability of the supply, and therefore, beyond just scrap, what else? The other options will have to compete with each other. And this can be either in the case of conventional blast furnaces or CCUS or hydrogen-based options. In a world, in the middle chart, in our 3rd-degree case, where the carbon costs are insufficient, traditional blast furnace applications will still remain the second choice. However, where there is a sufficient carbon price, then CCUS applications will become viable versus traditional options, and then they will become a battle between your hydrogen options and blast options. Right, let's move on to the next slide. So once again, if we want to take a look at CCS in the steel sector, what are the key factors that we want to take a look at? Well, similarly to power, a lot of it is policy, not just carbon price in the case of steel, but also in the implementation of carbon border adjustments. Much of the steel production is exported globally, and without the corresponding measures in place, there is a risk of carbon leakage, where producers or importers can export can relocate high emissions industries such as blast furnaces to countries which do not have the carbon policies in place. So it requires, I guess, an additional layer of policy support in order to push forward the CCUS. I've already touched on points such as subsidies and great CCUS cost improvements, so I won't go into them further. One other point to highlight is the end here is around the applicability of green steel premium to CCUS. Right now, it's important to highlight CCUS does not capture all of the CO2 coming from steel, from the blast furnace application. There's still a significant, potentially up to 50% of the carbon dioxide that doesn't get captured, depending on how the plant is designed. And therefore, it's if, and a big if, whether your steel from CCUS equipped plants could be considered green steel. in such a case where there is some kind of premium that can be attached to the production from these from CCUS equipped plants, then it could also support the case for CCUS. On the other hand, what will make it less competitive? This will rely to a great extent on the viability of other low carbon options, particularly hydrogen, and the speed and the scale to which it will be deployed to substitute CCUS. All right, let's move on to some of our conclusions to draw from our presentation. So just one thing I wanted to highlight is, how would our conclusions, how would our insights differ in a 1.5 degree scenario? Just want to highlight that, at least under Wood Mackenzie's 1.5 degree pathway scenario, we actually would project even more CCUS capacity compared to a 2 degree scenario. This is because both for a need for a faster deployment of all levers in order to reduce emissions in the near term, as well as basically a stricter requirement to abate all remaining emissions by 2050. And therefore, on that basis, our scenario at least looks at projects a greater CCUS capacity. So what are some of the key uncertainties or some of the key factors which can change our conclusions here? One is around the speed of near-term CCS adoption. How fast would carbon policies be enacted to drive quicker adoption of CCUS? At the same time, one may ask, well, in a 1.5 degree scenario, wouldn't low carbon technologies advance even faster and substitute the need for CCUS? And that is also true. And that becomes one of the key uncertainties as well. How soon and how fast will low carbon options, such as long duration storage, such as hydrogen feedstock, come into play in order to substitute the need for CCUS? And at the same time, how resilient will some of the projects that have retrofit with CCUS be? These changes will not happen overnight. So how long can these CCUS projects continue to operate, and how willing are businesses be willing to write off sunk costs? And finally, it's around the long-term need for negative emissions. This is around in a 1.5 degree scenario, we will require a greater use of direct air capture and bioenergy CCUS, and therefore there remains a certain segment of demand that will be required for CCUS. Let's move on to the next slide. Finally, our last slide here before passing back to Valerie. It's around some of the key takeaways for investors looking at CCUS projects. The first one is really around looking at CCUS capacity projections, not as a predetermined outcome, but as a requirement. We need all in our scenarios in order to maintain the carbon, to keep under the carbon budget. We require all levers in order to achieve it, to keep temperature rise below 2 degrees. As such, think of CCUS not as a something that would happen and a market that would emerge, but rather it requires a lot of supporting elements in order to realize a requirement. Second is around thinking of CCUS, not in the context of just cost, but in the context of the role that it needs to play in a target sector and market and what it will actually compete against. The third point is around carbon pricing and policy support. This is absolutely fundamental to helping CCUS work. Otherwise, without such policy support, it will need to be, businesses may need to consider it as the cost of doing business in the context of government requirements or social pressures, and they need to question then, are they willing to bear this cost? The fourth point is around key low carbon technologies representing the greatest uncertainty. As mentioned, in power, it's around long duration storage. In steel, it's around hydrogen-based feedstocks. There's a great uncertainty on how soon they will appear, but certainly investors will need to keep an eye out on the latest developments to and because they have the greatest implication on the role of CCUS. Fifth point is around having the right elements in place. CCUS can work. However, this depends to a large extent on both the project merits of the project itself and the location to which a project is located. And therefore, you need to look carefully at the merits of each opportunity. And finally, when you look at your companies in your portfolio, when you look at their decarbonization strategies and the role the CCUS plays in that strategy, do they reflect the considerations that we have outlined through our presentation and above? Okay.
Maybe I'll just share just a kind of one or two last thoughts here with regards to CCUS. I think from our perspective, I think CCUS, it is not what we call a slam dunk solution. It's not a solution that is readily available that we can use today in a widespread manner. And so as and when companies come out and say that CCUS is a option for them to decarbonize, I think it's really digging into the details of the plan and the feasibility of them achieving what they've set out to achieve. And as Alan mentioned, policy is really, really important in allowing this to happen. So I think that's kind of where we're coming from. And just one more note to make is with regards to the study that we have done. I think what we have done here is we've taken a relatively broad brush to try to analyze and categorize the opportunities and the cost in CCS in a particular industry and in a particular location. And we all know for sure that within a certain country, including China, the power systems in each area is different, the weather is different, the renewable resources available is different. And so, there will be nuances and differences in terms of the analysis that we have done. And that is why, as mentioned earlier, it's important for companies to, and investors to dig into the plans of companies when they're talking about CCUS. And it's not going to be the same for each and every project. So that's kind of where we're coming from.
All right, thank you so much, Josh, for that, and Ellen for going through in so much detail of the report. I don't think I'm seeing any questions, but you've done brilliantly on time. So just perhaps, again, a thank you to you for putting things into perspective. The feasibility of deployment of the technology obviously has a lot of complex considerations that you have outlined very helpfully. And perhaps for my part here, just to draw the report launch to a close, I will end with some actions and takeaways for investors and companies. And that is, investors do engage with the companies that you're engaging with and gain a deeper understanding on that sector relevance piece. And the questions that Wood Mackenzie has posed towards the end there, I think are very relevant questions for you to ask of the companies as they present you with a decarbonization solution focused on CCS. If they do that, then there are questions to be asked to understand the feasibility of that. Also engage with policymakers to understand sort of what infrastructures are going to be in play. For companies, I think the perspective that we have here is that CCS really should be implemented only to neutralize the residual emissions. And so we do want to look at this as a bridging technology to a carbon constrained world, especially for the hard to abate sectors. So any detail in your disclosure that you're able to provide with respect to the deployment of CCS technologies, I think that's the much needed information that investors will be looking at. And finally, on the next slide, a few sort of key concluding points would be that, just to reiterate, the deployment of CCS, we expect that sort of the competitiveness of the deployment of that as the competition from other low carbon alternatives come about, then we do see that will be affected. Hard to abate sectors with less clear low carbon options, again, we see potentially increased viability in the deployment of CCS technology. However, we are very conscious of other emerging technologies that we need to keep an eye out for. And so investors, when you engage with companies on the decarbonization strategies, where they present you with CCS being the solution, it's important that we ask questions around how they sort of what role they play in the strategy to net zero transition. And if you sort of sense that it is being deployed to further prolong the use of fossil fuels, then it is probably warrant additional questions to ask of the companies. And ultimately, as Wood Mackenzie has also pointed out there, the role of government planning will be a key determining factor, whether or not policies are being created to level the playing field for CCS or for other solutions will have an impact eventually. So with that, I think we have covered the report really substantially, but I do encourage people to do go and have a read for yourself. There are a lot of additional statistics in the appendix and a lot of detail in the report itself that I would urge you to go into detail and do feel free to come back to us if you have any questions. But we've sort of passed sort of the top of the hour for 4 minutes now. I think we're sort of just in time to go into the next session. So we'll do that. We have an expert panel of 5 speakers. Very thankful to them for putting in time today again to support the launch of the report. If you have questions for the speakers, do put them into the chat, into the Q&A box there. I do realize that there's also another channel where people are looking at this, sort of viewing this report launch from. So please do send your comments there as well, and we will get them. And excuse me, so the next speaker that we have up is Eric. Eric has been one of the few investors who has really been giving us a lot of support throughout the report writing process. They've reviewed our report, provided us with input. And upon learning that this is going to be scoped for power and steel only, he offered to provide additional input for the cement sector as well. So really thankful for your time there, Eric. And really looking forward to your presentation there. So Fergus, if you could quickly introduce Eric as well as we have him ready for the presentation, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, the next speaker, thank you, Valerie. Next speaker will be Eric Nish. He is the head of ESG Research and Integration Asia for Manulife Investment Management. He's based in Singapore and responsible for setting the ESG research, integration, and active ownership agenda in Asia. So pass to you, Eric, for the next presentation.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks, Firdaus and Valerie, and also to Joshua and Alan for this report. I think it's so important as there are all of these net zero and decarbonization commitments to look at this technology in detail and think about how the role it can play in those plans. And so I think power and steel were very well covered. So I'll just try and make a few quick comments on the cement industry. But before I do that, I'll just make a couple of quick comments about where we are today. And so this chart on the left shows the emissions that we can expect from the existing fossil fuel infrastructure around the world, just the remaining useful life of those assets over time. And so on the left, it's shown here through 2050 as the life of those assets plays out. And then on the right, it's showing cumulative emissions. And what you can see is that the existing infrastructure that we have today will take us beyond the 1.5 degree limit of around 500 gigatons, or about 400 at a 67% confidence. So we need to, I think this report is so important because even if we were to build only low carbon infrastructure, new builds starting today, we still need to address the existing infrastructure. And so on the next slide, we can also see that we don't have a lot of time to do this. So we really need to begin taking action today, begin reducing emissions today. And this graph just shows the pace of the decline that's needed at different starting points. And if we continue at the current levels for another 10 years, then we will use up the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. So we really need to take these actions today, but at the same time, we can't really wait 15 or 20 years for the technology to become viable. So the next slide shows how some of this could be applied within the cement industry. This is a roadmap that was released by the industry, the Global Cement and Concrete Association. And the top line shows the emissions that could be expected just given the growth of the industry under business as usual conditions. And then the gray lines show the emissions trajectory to reach net zero by 2050. And the different colors show the various pathways to get there. And so you can see that the industry's plan is for carbon capture to be the biggest driver of over about 1/3 of the reduction, which is shown in purple. And so this is what the industry has released earlier this year. So if we dive into that a little bit, we can look at the cost of some of these technologies. So this is a chart from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which shows some of the different carbon capture technologies shown in different colors and the average cost. And so I put red boxes around the technologies that apply to the cement industry. And you can see that they have an average cost of about $54 to $132 per ton. And so on the next slide, we can also see that in addition to the cost of capture, there is also a cost of transporting the CO2 once it is captured. And so the left shows overseas shipping and the right shows on-land trucking or the pipeline alternatives. And so I won't go into the details, but we can expect this to add a few more dollars of cost, which varies mostly depending on the volume of CO2 that's transported and the distance. And that could be a problem for the cement industry because cement is so heavy and concrete, it tends to be produced quite locally. And so it's not necessarily scalable, and the distances needed to transport it to storage locations could be far. So on the next slide, if we look at the ability of the industry to absorb these costs, the chart in the upper right shows the amount of CO2 per dollar of revenue. And you can see that the emissions per revenue are much higher compared to the other hard to abate sectors. So steel, like we were looking at, but this is also showing chemicals, mining, and oil and gas production. And then if we compare that to the revenue per ton, this shows the historic prices in China. And that equates to about, in the bottom left in purple, and that equates to about $60 to $100 of revenue per ton of cement. On the top left, we can look at the emissions from those tons of cement. So I've removed the names of the companies, but this shows about 15 different companies and their average emissions per ton of cement in blue. And the companies that have targets are shown in yellow. The red line shows the EU's taxonomy limit on cement, which is at about 1/2 ton of emissions per ton of cement. So we can think about how that plays into the revenue, but it's probably more relevant to think about the ability of costs and profit to absorb this. So on the next slide, I've shown just an illustrative example of this. So the purple line in this graph shows the historic profit margins over the past couple of decades for the industry. And you can see that the operating profit averages about 12%. And so the profit margins after taking out the interest and tax, tend to run in the single digits. But even if we use a conservative assumption of 10% margins, and we look at that, 2 tons of cement per ton of CO2 emissions, we can see that would translate into about $140 to $200 of revenue, or $14 to $20 of profit. And so if we think about the costs of that capture and transport compared to the size of the profit margins, it's at least 3 to 10 times the entire profit of the industry. So even if these costs came down by 300 to 1,000%, they would still kind of wipe out the entire profit of the industry. So even if the price got to $5 to $10, it would still reduce the profit in this sector by about half. So on the next slide, I think this shows that industry roadmap again, and I think we really need to think about the different drivers of emissions reduction and whether carbon capture can really be the biggest driver. So I think there's a number of alternatives coming to the market. So if we look at the savings in the clinker production, the clinker is one of the largest emitting parts of the cement process, which is shown in orange. There are other innovations there that could be quite substantial. So in this roadmap, it's showing about 10 or 11%, but there's a technology called limestone calcinated clay concrete, which can reduce the emissions by 40 or 50%. And so that's called LC3 technology. And so that kind of alternative could be maybe more likely the things that get us to net zero. They might be more disruptive, but I think we have to consider those options. And so the next slide shows some work that has done this. So this is from the Climate Works Foundation, and it looks at 2 kind of roadmaps for getting to net zero. So the graphic on the left shows the options if we were to take a very production-centric model, the type of model that the industry might consider. But if we look at all of the options that are available, taking a whole systems approach or an ecosystem approach, then the reliance on carbon capture actually comes down quite a bit. So if we think about things like using less cement through better design, or better ways of recycling cement and using substitute materials, then there are other ways, other kind of pathways and roadmaps that could work and could maybe be more likely. So this is just kind of a summary, but hopefully provides a bit of a complement to the very good work that's been done on the power and steel sector.
Hi, Eric. Thank you so much for that presentation. It's definitely helpful to have that additional perspective. I don't think we have any questions in the Q&A, but certainly I think what you've looked at will, not only from the cement perspective, but also more broadly from the systems perspective, is an important point to ponder on as we engage with companies. So thank you very much for that additional input. So I think in the interest of time, I might just move on to the next session with Seiji Kawazoe, who is the Senior Stewardship Officer at Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Asset Management. He has a very strong global experience across multiple markets as a global equities portfolio manager, and is responsible for building ESG capacity in the firm, which now has an assets under management of over 750 billions of US dollars. So Seiji is also responsible for stewardship oversight of global institutional investment assets such as public funds, private pension funds. Also, he is the steering committee member at Climate Action 100+, committee member of the PRI Investor Policy Dialogue on Deforestation, and a member of the investor group of the 30% Club in Japan. So investor wearing numerous caps, involved in many initiatives as well. So thank you for having thank you for your time today, Seiji. Yeah. Right, thank you so much for that opening remark. So I understand that we want to do this more of a Q&A style. So I have some questions, and I think it's probably helpful for us to go sort of sector by sector. But thank you for that overview, which is really helpful, because I think in your role you sort of engage via Climate Action 100+. So you are certainly involved with engaging with the steel sector. We also have you involved as an investor in the Asia Utility Engagement Program. So obviously also lots of conversations with the power sector as well. So maybe let's sort of lean on your insight there from each of these sectors, starting with the power sector. So generally, as you talk to the electric utilities, are they talking about sort of the investments in the different decarbonization technologies? Are they talking about CCUS, or are they talking about battery storage, for example, which is also very important? I noticed that I missed sort of a comment earlier on, which talked about sort of battery storage as well. So just from your perspective as an investor engaging in the sort of electric utility sector, what kind of conversations are the power companies giving you right now? What kind of sort of engagement questions are you exchanging with them at the moment? Thank you. So I think the first part of your comment there alludes to the fact that government policies in Japan as well, and similarly in other countries play a critically important role. But I think at the end of the day, it's always a question as to are the companies also playing their part? Do you think sort of the ambition question as to whether or not you think they are demonstrating sufficient level of ambition, do you think you're able to comment on that? I know it's not a sort of straightforward yes or no question. It's definitely, there's a lot more parts to that. But you know, just generally, do you think there's anything that companies should be doing more of, in addition to sort of following the government's lead, or sort of engaging with the government for policies that would be contributive to the technologies that they are pushing for?
And also, I think the role of the power utilities, as I said, that they are also the distributor of those the power to the retail and wholesale. And I think there's a room for them to encourage the usage of the renewable energy, so that there'll be more adaptation of these renewable energy power sources, as well as the infrastructure such as battery business. I think the battery business, the success of the retail battery business will be dependent on the power distributor, which is I think the power utility companies are able to do.
Thank you, Seiji. That's really helpful. I think a couple minutes for each sector really doesn't do it justice, but we're sort of you know, restrained by time. So let's move on to the steel sector as well. For the steel sector, we've sort of seen a couple of times the decarbonization solutions are not as clear, and so it's a hard to abate sector. So you as an investor, as you talk to steel companies, what is your view of companies who are showing you that, okay, their decarbonization plans are heavily reliant on emerging technologies such as CCUS? What kind of, if presented with such a plan, what kind of information would you as an investor be asking of the companies with regards to that plan, which which relies on emerging technologies such as CCS or others, if you prefer to comment?
I think the steel industry, I think this can also be said to the cement industry, just Eric has explained to us, but these are the industries that with a very heavy capital spending, you know, for their businesses, and they need to optimize the best available resources, and to be very cost effective to actually put money into new technologies. And I think for the steel industry, I think they are working for any sort of steel company. They're aiming for the zero carbon steel going forward. And I think the usage of the hydrogen reduction iron will be one of the goals that I think by after 2030 and 2050 will be kind of a major development and the application. And we have also started to see some of the hydrogen reduction iron being implemented in European countries such as SSAB may start to use that for the usage of the Volvo, for example. And I think those are the new sort of technology developments or the introduction to the market. So I think these steel industry are so carefully watching those industry trends and start more sort of robust commitments towards its capital spending towards those new technologies. So the meanwhile, the CCS will be kind of fill the gap between what's happened today and likely to happen beyond 2030 or onwards. And with the introduction of those new technologies with the high hydrogen reduction iron. I think there are within the I think still the blast furnace will be the major sort of sources of their production. So therefore, here again, the CCS will also play some role for the application for that. So I think the steel industry needs to be much more cost vigilant due to their nature of their nature of their product and the very competitive environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seiji. I think there were originally quite a few other questions that we wanted to dive into more detail of, but I'm conscious of the time. We have a few more speakers to go to. So I'm afraid we probably have to draw this to a close here, but really helpful to have your insights on both sectors. And thank you for your input today. Thank you very much again. So yeah, thank you, Seiji. So next on, we have Jacqueline from Transition Zero. Ferdis, would you like to give a quick introduction to her before we move on to her presentation? Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. So quick introduction to the next speaker, which is Jacqueline Tao. Jacqueline is an analyst at Transition Zero, a data and analytics organization focused on the energy transition to zero carbon for the power and heavy industry sector. So pass on to Jacqueline for the next presentation. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Fed. Thanks, Valerie. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jacqueline, and as Fed has mentioned, I'm an analyst at Transition Zero, and it's definitely my pleasure today to share with you some of my thoughts on some of the hard choices to be made when deciding on which technologies to bank on in terms of decarbonization. So before I start, I would just like to thank Fed and Valerie and AIGCC for inviting me to speak at this event. It's awesome, and I really want to congratulate them on the launch of the report, which I believe would be a critical resource to spur discussions about CCS deployment in the region. So moving on, I'll just like to do a quick intro about Transition Zero for those who are very unfamiliar with my organization. We're actually a nonprofit organization with a mission to produce independent, data-driven economic and financial analysis and insights to drive decarbonization efforts in the electricity and industrial sector. So that definitely sounds like a mouthful, but essentially on a day-to-day basis, what we do is we combine satellite imagery with machine learning and sensor technologies with advanced data science to fill critical data gaps in the energy sector. And then we overlay that with economic and financial modeling and to deliver actionable insights and analysis to support decision-making of investors as well as policymakers to aid in the discussion about decarbonization. So if we go on to the next slide, please. One of our flagship reports is actually the Turning the Supertanker report, which looks at China's net zero ambitions through a coal retirement lens. So in this report, what we did is we used satellite imagery and machine learning to come up with coal plant emissions on a plant-by-plant basis and overlay that with fundamental analysis on China's ETS system to predict coal plant closures through a proprietary risk index system. So we intend for this to support the government their own net zero ambitions. And we're very grateful that the report was actually very well received, garnering around 330 press articles across reputable titles. And we're definitely very excited that our reports landed in the hands of the Chinese climate envoy and hopefully have contributed to the policy discussions surrounding China's climate ambitions. So this is actually an example of how Transition Zero's work hopes to impact business and policy decision-making on the topic of decarbonization. So now diving in directly to the day, if you go to the next slide, please. What are some of the factors that investors are considering when they're looking at banking or investing into a developing decarbonization technology? So we have identified, for factors that investors might be interested in. Obviously, there's other ancillary factors, but we've just given it some thought to what are 4 of the most important criteria. So definitely for the first one, it would be whether this investment is going to be a more project-focused investment, or are we entail forgoing some of the short-term benefits for long-term options in terms of, you know, expanding the decarbonization suite or aligning with corporate strategy like 10 or a decade down the road. A second key important factor would be the technology readiness level. So that is an indicator of whether where the technology stands in terms of maturity, which determines the risk and reward matrix. So it would also have a role to play in determining whether the organization should have appropriate risk sharing mechanisms with other organizations, business entities, or policymakers, just to understand and spread the risk around, especially for more early stage technologies that are still in the development stage or research stage even. The third factor is definitely of interest to most of the investors, which is the financial viability of the project. We suggest dissecting the intrinsic financial viability of the project or the standalone financial viability of the project, absent of any policies, support, and subsidies. So we understand that CCS is sometimes dependent perhaps on the future high carbon price or the availability of tax incentives. So we need to dissect to view the financial viability of the project as a standalone project itself, just to understand how the project, to what extent the project is dependent on policy support. Then lastly, one other factor would be like the strategic alignment with long-term strategy, or if they have a net zero plan, their net zero plan, and definitely investments into a certain technologies should be broadly in alignment with global mega trends, such as like trends in ESG investing, decarbonization, as well as national level net zero plans going forward. So at the back end of it all, we can see that these 4 factors interact a lot with each other as well as with policy. So you can view, I think this is a topic that a lot of the speakers ahead of me have already spoken about, the importance of policy in determining and holding some sway over the decisions that investors are making into decarbonization technologies. So I'll like to take the next few minutes to just dig a little bit deeper into what policymakers are thinking. So if you go on to the next slide, please, we can actually see that policy making, it's not a monolith. In fact, policy making, it's very much complicated. So there are various different aspects to consider when during the policy making process, with competing if not conflicting policy priorities. So actually policymakers would have to make trade-offs and prioritize the policy objectives when deciding on what technologies they would like to invest more heavily in terms of the decarbonization technology toolbox. So definitely climate policy is front and center in a lot of discussions, and it may pertain to either country-specific goals, such as the NDCs they have signed up for, as well as any net pledges they might have, and also global goals in terms of Paris alignment to 1.5 degree warming. The next factor would be energy policy decision making. So definitely with energy emissions accounting for like a majority or a large portion of any country's emissions, energy policy would have a role to play. In terms of what makes energy policy making a little bit more complicated is this energy policy making trilemma, where we have 3 different energy policy objectives: security, affordability and access, and sustainability, and 3 can't be met at the same time. So there are trade-offs of 1 or maybe 2 of these policy pillars that you have to consider for the energy sector. So the next one we consider is the industrial policy, and it's actually most often an aspect that is given a lot more consideration than other factors due to its like key links to the country's competitiveness as well as its economic growth. So investment into decarbonization technologies would ideally strengthen a country's position in terms of spearheading domestic industrial transformation, which would put it into a position to support technological exports, as well as like placing it at a critical point along the global low carbon supply chain, which would enhance its growth prospects into the future. So in recent years, trade policy have also revised in a lot of the policy discussions that we talked about. So trade policies would mean that would take into account the balance of payment positions that country has in relation to its key trade partners, and that is increasingly being intertwined in the discussion, particularly with the rise of new low carbon green fuels such as hydrogen and to a lesser extent ammonia. So definitely there's a bucket for all the other policy aspects that, that is considered, including stakeholder buy-in, public opinion and otherwise. So if you overlay that with considerations for CCS deployment, on the next slide, you can actually see that there are different considerations that you may have. So there are investor considerations as well as policy maker considerations and a bunch of overlapping considerations. In terms of investor considerations, definitely cost is a big thing. I think that's what Ellen has alluded to. It's a big thing. It might not be the only thing, but it's definitely a big thing. So on the cost side of things, CCS still faces a bit of a technical hurdle in terms of its high energy consumption needs. So that means that there may be significant energy efficiency penalties associated with CCS technologies. In the power sector, that figure goes up to 25 to 30%, which means that about a quarter or a third of the energy that's produced can never be sold just because it's consumed within the plant itself, and that definitely has a drag on financial viability of the project. Another key consideration is that there is a lack of CCS value chain in a lot of the countries that might take decades to develop. So what this means is that for the project developer hoping to, for example, build a CCS-equipped coal-fired power plant, they would have to internalize a lot of the external costs related with CCS project development, including site selection, site assessment, building of transport pipelines, and so on. So what this means is that it will lead to steep short-term costs and discourage investment, the private sector investment, and then it will take longer to develop a whole CCS value chain in the country. So it's essentially a chicken and egg problem. Policymakers, I think the key thing that we are worried about is that there is not a lot of understanding about the storage potential for a lot of the countries. A lot of the countries are actually viewing CCS as a key policy, technological pillar to their decarbonization and net zero plans, but without a clear understanding of the storage potential, it is very dangerous because you might end up with a future where the captured CO2 has nowhere else to go due to filling up the potential storage sites. So we need more understanding and analysis into that before we can have, a right assessment or a data-driven, data-backed assessment of the role of CCS in the technology suite, in the decarbonization technology suite specifically. So so of course, when you talk about CCS, you couple that with CCUS, which is the utilization factor, and there's a potential for CO2 that's being captured to fulfill other industrial needs. Oops, sorry, if you go back to the previous slide, please. At this current stage, EOR is the only commercially viable application of CO2 that's being captured, and the current narrative on decarbonization into this whole idea of a large-scale deployment of CO2 that's captured for advanced oil recovery. So obviously there's overlapping concerns. I think with Valerie has already touched upon the risk of CO2 leakages on land sites as well. lithium battery storage even might be more commercially competitive compared to CCS. And lastly, an issue that we are concerned with as well is that there might be unrealistic expectations of a mass CO2 rollout that might delay the retirement of high carbon assets and was still loss-making high carbon assets that might drag on, might have financial and environmental consequences into the future. So essentially you're delaying the inevitable, and that's coming at additional costs. So I'd like to take the rest of my limited time to speak a little bit about what is happening, the position of CCS in Japan's power sector. So what this chart shows is actually the marginal abatement curve for Japan's power sector in 2030. So the marginal abatement curve, or MAC for short, is actually a key tool that investors and policymakers use to compare abatement options or just emissions reduction options. So essentially, the curve lines up the potential emissions reduction technologies based on the marginal cost of carbon emissions abated on $1 per ton of CO2 level. This chart is something similar to what Eric has shown in the previous presentations and discussions, with the other element that the width of each block actually represents its abatement technology, abatement potential in terms of ton per CO2 basis. So actually each block here represents the potential abatement technology, to the leftmost end of the chart are considered low-hanging fruits, and if it's a negative figure, it means that money can be saved and there's financial gains associated with replacing coal-fired power plants with these technologies. And this low-hanging fruit should definitely be maximized first before moving up the curve to support deeper decarbonization in the sector. So from the chart, you can see that the black chart towards the middle of the chart is where CCS is for Japan in 2030. So when compared to renewable energy, definitely it's not exactly the best abatement option, as is considered one of the more costly abatement technologies in the suite. But definitely, please note that there's a major caveats here associated with this conclusion, because it does not take into account the system requirements in terms of ancillary services, grid stability, reliability that currently base load plants such as coal with CCS is going to contribute to the grid in terms of availability and reliability. But definitely there's potential for other technologies to support this kind of deeper decarbonization as well. And they can be low carbon technologies. So if you move on to the next slide, please. Well, in the interest of time, I'll cut this short. Essentially what this slide is intending to say is that policymaking is not a science, it's more of an art. And there are various policies, strategies that aims to support one policy goal, and actually what that means is that there are multiple trajectories that could happen in the future, and the future is definitely not static, even if you look at it from a policy perspective. So I'll just end off with how investors should be responding to this kind of uncertainties, not only with regards to policy, but also the current investment decisions. And that will be on the next slide. So we believe that scenario analysis is actually a good tool for not only investors, but also companies to assess the impact of the financial risk stemming from climate change that could really help inform strategic planning. Right, so I think that's an end for me. I'll end off here and I'll just pass the time back to Valerie and Vid.
Thank you, Jacqueline. That's certainly very helpful for us to understand the key players and the policymakers, and also other stuff that related to deploying CCS on a large scale and other decarbonization technologies. So next, in the interest of time, let me introduce the next speakers, which is Chai Yuan. He is the carbon neutrality specialist for Synta Green Finance, and Since 2006, he's a consultant for governments and corporates and has been engaged in China low carbon institutional development from the very beginning. So next to you, Chao Yuan, for the next remarks and presentation. Thank you.
Can I speak in make the presentation in Chinese?
Yes.
Sure, go ahead. So the previous speakers make some scenario analysis more from the macro perspective. I recently engaged with some Chinese companies on the design of their carbon neutrality roadmaps. So I would like to give you more of the perspective of companies with regard to how they see CCS deployment and their applications. The first, a simple matrix. We can put a company or put companies in a sector into different categories based on their characteristics. A sector can be of high sensitivity to climate change or low sensitivity. Steel and power are very sensitive to government policies. And on the left-hand side and the right-hand side on the horizontal axis, you will see companies that cannot easily shift to a zero carbon production model. We refer to them as transferable sectors, but for sectors that are highly adaptable, that can even enable other sectors to achieve zero carbon, we refer to them as transferable sectors. So why do I put companies such as log cabin or recreational vehicle? Actually, I approach it, we see it as a economy. We can see it as a recreational site. We face this target to achieve 1.5 degree, and before 2030, we need to peak carbon emissions and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. So in a limited period of time, we need to achieve zero carbon. This is very similar to a recreational site that has to evacuate its residents when flooding is coming. So for log cabin, it cannot move itself to somewhere safe. But for recreational vehicle, it can move to safer places. And for touring cars, and they can also move. So in this process, we see that there is the issue of stranded assets. So for log cabin, it's similar to coal-fired power plant or thermal plants or a blast furnace. And in China, we also have trillions of dollars of such kind of assets. If they are like the log cabins, if they cannot make transitions, then the cost for zero carbon transition for them would be very high. So how to think about the proper ways for transition? If a company in its assets, they only have fixed assets, and if the fixed assets are high carbon, then just like the log cabin, they cannot move, they cannot shift. Then they need to make merger and acquisitions, and they need to introduce partners. For example, they can work with the recreational vehicles to change their technology pathways to make sure they can have a way to adapt to low carbon. If we take the steel industry as an example, in China, steel production accounts for around 50% of the total steel output in the world. And in China, for 90% of the steel production, they use blast furnace. So if for and for a steel sector, they also have scraps, and they are not very sensitive to carbon neutrality policies, but they can use CCS rather than relying on EOR. They can turn those materials into construction materials. And also for some SOE steel companies that are developing green hydrogen. They can also work with thermal plants or oil and gas companies, chemical companies to develop CCS technology. And the steel companies can also work with cement plants. Cement plants are currently developing concrete curing technologies to deal with the carbon produced. So in the process of making zero carbon transition, all the blast furnace assets would have to be abandoned to shift to other technologies. And we can use hydrogen, increase hydrogen to substitute nitrogen. This way, so the oxygen combustion technology is too expensive for them. It allows them to capture carbon, but it will not enable the steel sector to compete with other their competitors. So the so the steel company work with other companies to use oxidation and combustion technology to reduce the cost of CCS. And they can also use technologies to capture carbon dioxide. This way, they can reduce the expenses because they can sell the carbon dioxide produced. So it addresses two issues. One is how to reduce the marginal cost of CCS, and second, how to turn carbon dioxide into a feedstock rather than just a pollutant that has to be dealt with. So all the technologies are there. It can help blast furnace to be retrofitted to better capture technology to achieve net zero transition. So this is the overall model. If we solely rely on the traditional tangible assets for high carbon industries and sectors, it would be very hard for them to cut their emissions, and they will face high risk of becoming stranded assets. But if companies that are engaged in CO2 utilization and developing hydrogen, they can work with those traditional industries so that the log cabin can be converted into recreational vehicle. So our basic judgment is that going forward, the steel industry can work with many other sectors, such as the thermal sector, to better utilize carbon dioxide or utilize green hydrogen. So this way, for a steel company, all its sectors, all its processes will not solely depend on the steelmaking process. Instead, they can have many other processes, such as developing green hydrogen. This way, a stranded high carbon assets steel company can be transitioned, and stranded assets can be avoided.
So here is a report that shows that when the cost of hydrogen is not very low, it predicts the efficiency and the competitiveness of the hydrogen plus CCS. So it is quite competitive. By the end of November, a company published its net zero transition pathway. And we can see here that it also contains the processing of, or process of by the blast furnace. So it applies the model of CCS plus hydrogen-rich oxy-fuel blast furnace. So it avoided the phenomenon of stranded assets of blast furnace worth of over $1 trillion RMB. So it realizes the zero carbon steel making. We can see that it is relevantly competitive. Apart from blast furnace, there are also other net zero steel making technologies. Overall, we can see a lot of Chinese companies are trying to apply different technologies plus CCS. And I'd like to project as well that CCS may not be very widely used in all industries. In other words, not all companies may use CCS to realize net zero because the cost of CCS still face competition from renewables. However, for steel, power, and cement industries, there is potential to have CCS retrofit. So as we can see in the matrix just now, some companies in these countries, companies may avoid the phenomenon of stranded assets. And in this wave of net zero transition, they may successfully increase the value. So from the perspective of companies, they need to think about how to tap the potential of these different technologies so as to outperform their competitors. Now, compared with chemical industries and compared with steel industries, for thermal industries, there may not be very high potential. They can only capture CO2. But other conditions are quite limited. So they cannot capture or store CO2 at a very low cost. So compared with steel or power industries, the coal-powered industries may not widely apply CCS. They may still use CCS, but as a complementary method. So I think this is my projection. I think a minority of companies in the thermal power industry may heavily use CCS. That's all for my input. Thank you. Oh, by the way, this is the net zero pathway by the company that I just talked about. As you can see, ultimately, they want to reduce 30% to 50% carbon by the hydrogen-rich oxy-fuel blast furnace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cao Dong. I'm sorry for rushing you on there, but we do have a very limited time. And finally, we do have Dan Gardner from AIGCC, Climate Transition Specialist with a background in sell-side equity analyst and numerous firms, including Deutsche Bank and RHA. So Dan, thank you so much. Sorry we've overran there, but so maybe we only will be able to have a few quick exchanges. So maybe can you give us sort of a quick overview of the general sentiment in Europe for the technology CCS? How is this currently positioned amongst European companies and other comments that you're able to make from that perspective? Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. Can I just check you can hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you for the invite, and it's great to see some excellent sort of content and interesting slides to pick up on that you've presented, and you've invited me to kind of present a kind of European or global perspective on some of these issues. I wanted to flag that. The aim of those reports was essentially to identify what actions companies need to take and how investors can accelerate those actions to deliver net zero in that sector. So there's an image there of one of those reports and some links at the bottom of the page, and I would encourage people to take a look at them to get more detail. The key kind of overriding messages is obviously some of which have already been echoed, but 1.5 requires urgent action, and CCS in that context does have some challenges and has some severe limitations. To summarize the results from both sectors, specifically on CCS, companies should focus primarily on emissions reductions through reducing fossil fuel use, not through widespread CCS deployment. That's largely a reflection of the kind of emerging or early stage of commercialization of the technology and some of the challenges, but also that point about 1.5 and the need for urgent action. And in light of that, I think investors that are looking at these companies to assess whether companies have credible net zero plans, they want to see any companies that are specifying the reliance on CCS as to overcome those challenges, and that level of detail is what many investors are now considering kind of basic level for companies to articulate a credible strategy there. So those are the kind of two, I guess, overarching feedback. But if we turn to the next slide, Valerie, one of probably the most interesting area of the report on the power side was some of the feedback that we got from European utilities on the use of CCS. So they said we hosted some roundtables earlier in the year. NL have come out publicly recently and got some headlines saying it, but they are actually skeptical about the potential for CCUS, largely due to its early the challenges of the technology itself and the cost of the technology, and they are intended. That's not preventing them setting ambitious net zero targets. They believe that they can still get to net zero without using CCS, and some of those challenges, particularly in the power sector, seem to be reflected on the IEA's most recent thinking, which is lowering the contribution of CCS to emissions reductions by 2050. So that chart on the right-hand side there showing essentially halving from B2S to NGE scenarios. So that's it on the power side. On the steel side, I think echoing again some of the earlier themes, it looks like though the absolute volumes may be similar, the level of contribution to emissions reductions is going to be, it could be significantly greater in steel, largely because of the absence of at this stage, or low-cost alternatives. So those are the kind of headline takeaways, and in the interest of time, I kind of kept it short there, but would encourage investors and companies to take a look at those sector reports.
Thank you so much, Dan. And with that, I think that serves as a very good remark to close the conversations around whether or not CCS application is feasible for different sectors. Obviously, there's a lot of complexity into this discussion, and it's not a one-size-fits-all solution at all. And sorry for not doing justice to having more discussion with you, Dan, and a few other speakers as well. But truly appreciate the input that everyone has provided for us. The webinar has been recorded, and so if there are additional questions that people have and want to ask of the speakers, we are happy to have questions channeled through and feedback through to you, answers channeled back and feedback to you. So please, by all means, do reach out to us if you have any further questions about the report or about the application of CCS in general in different sectors. We're very happy to have further discussions around that. So thank you again to all of the speakers who have provided insight today. And thank you to Feardas, my colleague, and all other colleagues who has contributed to the report and the launch of this event, and to all the audience for your time. We will be sending an email with the relevant links and report for you to follow up on should you have any further questions. So with that, we're over time, and I think we should end here. Thank you again, everyone, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.